So, Dying Light 2 is now out, or it has been out for a little bit. I wanted to get out this review sooner, but I'm working within my means. You know, I have things going on outside of just playing games and making YouTube videos, so it's taken some time to get through the game, but after 31 and a half hours, I have fully completed it. Well, as much as fully completing it would be, which in the context of my playthrough was getting to the end, unlocking one of the endings, and now being here to do this review. In a world where, as of now, Sony is on that censorship speedrun, Nintendo is currently shutting down, or is slowly getting into the focus of shutting down Wii U and Nintendo 3DS stores, which that was inevitable, but with no way to properly preserve, hence the reason why piracy is very relevant nowadays. The one thing that these companies try to avoid, they end up only causing to be that much worse because of their own choices. Bobby Kotick has a second company. It's sort of like a second Epstein Island, if I were to assume. I mean, it would only make sense. It's not that, but I could definitely see it being that. But with all that other gaming gibberish and whatnot, we're here for Light of the Dying, the sequel. Light of Death, the second. And there's many things to discuss. And I have the notes here on this phone. I have a notepad. In fact, I'm going to it right now. Also, I don't know if you can really see the smoke coming through, but you see I have an incense lit right here. It's very low down on how much is left to utilize. You know, it's been a while since I lit the thing, so it's pretty close to being to the end of the stick. So I'm probably gonna light another mid-review because this shit smells good, it's relaxing, and, you know, that's good too. But yeah, anyways, so I have it all organized here on my phone. Let's get to what there is to say. Why don't we? And hopefully the gameplay footage isn't too terrible. So first off, I want to talk about the story because this is a game with a story, believe it or not. And not only that, it's an open world game with a story. One that follows a certain type of progression, one which has a plot, a narrative with characters, and things that happen, events that occur, something that you don't usually see in games. As we all remember, EA said it themselves, single-player games are dead, which, ironically enough, all these years later, their latest biggest game does not have a single-player campaign of any kind, and yet the game is fucking... It's worse than death, honestly. But let's blame Halo Infinite, a game which that also is nothing to write home about because of the lack of content and other things. Anyway, so when it comes to the story, I gotta say, it's definitely an improvement over the first game, which that's not saying much, but anything is better than the story of Dying Light 1. Literally anything. Okay, maybe not everything, but a lot of things are. A lot of other stories are. And Dying Light 2, in that regard, is no exception. Now, does that mean that Dying Light 2 story is anything to write home about? Certainly not. But all in all, it's definitely not bad. I would definitely say it's okay. I think it has some interesting characters, like Hakon, for example. He's someone that I think a lot of people will get attached to. The main character, Aiden, he treads on being alright at one point, and then being an annoying dickhead the next. Like, his tone and way he comes off, it's understandable. But God, he's a pain in the ass sometimes. Yet again, so am I, so who am I to talk? But we're talking about a video game protagonist here. So, let's continue on, why don't we? So, there's many characters outside of these two that I mentioned. You know, there's a lot to do with the different factions in the game, since that's a thing that's been talked about a lot leading up to the release of it. And while I definitely do like some of the characters, a lot of them, for the most part, are pretty forgettable. None of them are very in-depth, per se. A lot of it's serviceable, don't get me wrong, but it's nothing that you're going to... It's no Red Dead Redemption 2, let's just put it that way. But outside of that, outside of just the characters, in terms of the plot itself, it's serviceable, once again, but ultimately it's not something that's gonna be very memorable. It's full of all sorts of cliches and such, which every story is gonna have at least a few cliches, but really what it comes down to is the execution of said cliches, which this game doesn't really do that fantastic of a job of. It definitely could have been a lot better, but yet again, this is Dying Light, so who the hell is going to come here for a remarkable story? Another thing that has to do with the story are the choices that you make throughout it, which there's definitely some interesting ones, definitely some that make you go, oh shit, well, that was certainly a choice to make in a video game released in 2022, but a lot of them, they don't really seem to have too much of an impact. From what I've seen and from what I've read, a lot of the decisions end up with the same results anyways, which that's the case with a lot of games. Which that's not to say that's an excuse for Dying Light 2 to repeat the same mistakes, but I definitely do think that if you were expecting anything incredible in terms of plot decisions that you make in a game like this, or specifically this game, then you were overhyping, because there's no way that this game was going to live up to Techland's expectations for what they were going to do. With all the issues that this game was having, and after all this time for the game to turn out how it has, which it's not a bad game, even the title says, or unless I've changed it. It is a good game, it's just a lot was definitely a bit oversold. A lot was definitely overhyped. So long as you didn't buy into it, I think you'd be fine, but anyone who did believe everything Techland was saying, I definitely do think they were overdoing it a bit, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, as for the gameplay itself, the gameplay here is quite solid. It's definitely an improvement in a lot of ways. I like the paraglider, for example. I think that's a lot of fun to use. Granted, it was a bit of a pain in the ass to learn how to properly control, but in time, it became something that was definitely usable. It could be a little annoying at points, even after learning how to, but you know, it worked well enough. Another thing that I was alright with, which definitely could be annoying at points as well, but ultimately was a fun time to utilize, was the grappling hook. Combining that with the paraglider, running onto one of the air vents, and then launching off from it with a paraglider being brought out, and then from there, letting yourself drop down, and then grapple hooking over to a building, and then swinging off of that, and taking out your paraglider again. Just little things like that. There's a lot that you can do with the different equipments in the game, and not even just with that. In terms of killing zombies and regular enemies, I found it to be pretty fun. I definitely thought it was a good time to be had. Nothing absolutely mind-blowing, which that's honestly, I feel, the best way to describe this game. It definitely works for what it is. It's definitely fun. Weapon degradation honestly doesn't annoy me all that much. I know that was a concern before the game came out, but honestly, I'm not all that bothered by it. But ultimately, I don't think it was an issue at all, because with all the different weapons that you collect and pick up anyways, you're gonna have more than enough to be perfectly fine, I feel. Unless you're just so fucking bad at the game that you end up breaking every single weapon upon hitting an enemy once with it, which I don't know how you could possibly do that, how you could be that fucking terrible. But in the case of not being that, then I think that everything that you get will definitely help get through the game and have more than enough equipment by the end of it. Also, I wasn't bothered by the lack of guns. Granted, at first, when they announced that there wasn't going to be any regular guns to use in the game, I was a little disappointed by that, but considering what they're going for, just having melee weapons, I think it worked out well enough. Also, parkouring is pretty satisfying and fun as well. Granted, there's times where I did somehow end up overstepping my jump on certain platforms, and sometimes it's like, okay, I just want to jump over to this other platform. Come on, Aiden, whatever, fucking jump. Come on, don't be scared. I'm pressing the space button. If you could just jump, that would be highly appreciated. I still enjoyed what was there with that whole system. An improvement over the first game, but all that aside, which I personally felt was the best part of the game, we move on to some of the weaker aspects of it. Granted, the story already is some of that weakness, but there is more to be said, because again, for the 100th time, it feels like this game definitely could have been better. I said in the Dying Light 2 gameplay video, my gut was telling me this game was going to be good, if not better. I think that wasn't completely accurate. I think more so, this game is good, and it does have the potential to be better, but unfortunately that potential is not properly executed enough to where it does reach the point of being better than good, maybe great. There are other problems with the game that hold it back from being better than good, which I will get into later. But for now, I just want to focus on the open world and side content. It's fine. It's typical. It's your typical Ubisoft open world. You have the different side missions that you can complete from talking to characters. You activate certain parts of the electricity throughout the city by activating windmills. There's also different collectibles that you can get. You have different crates that you can loot. It's the same old that you expect with any open world game. The 500 hours of content, if there even really is 500 hours of content, because maybe I was just off about that, but it definitely doesn't feel that way. But if there is, then most of it, as I expected, was nothing but filler, which adds nothing to the game. And to be honest, the only side missions I really cared for were the side quests where they had something to do with the main story, where they were somewhat relevant to that aspect of the game, because even though the story isn't anything too incredible, it definitely did have enough intrigue to keep me invested enough to want to keep going to the very end. As dull of a final boss battle the ending may have been, but that's besides the point. But any other side quests in the game, I just really didn't care all that much for. I think that's where I'm gonna leave it at in terms of open world. It's more what you expect, which, I mean, this is definitely a thing lately. I mean, I think back to Halo Infinite. How I'm summing up Dying Light 2's open world definitely describes a lot of that as well. So I'm not going to really go on too much longer with that. So let's move on to another point I want to talk about. The RPG mechanics, because that's a thing that was marketed before the game's release. And so there's this whole choice system as that's a part of the story. So I've already talked about the RPG elements a little bit, so I'll just continue on with that. Just like the story, the RPG elements outside of that also don't have that much depth into any other aspect of the game, such as upgrading your character, which, yeah, you can upgrade your movements, your combat, your health, and all of that. There's definitely parts to do all that. You level up, you unlock tokens, you apply that. Ultimately, it's pretty basic. It's a fairly surface level RPG system that they have going on here. It's nothing too in-depth. It's just something that exists enough to be a thing in the game, but nothing more outside of that. It just works, and that's the best way to put it.
All of this just works.
Now, another thing that I almost forgot to mention, but I do have typed out here on my notepad, which, I mean, I've had it here, so how the fuck would I even forget? Anyways, another thing that's really good is the music. I think the soundtrack in this game is great. Alright, about to listen to the Dying Light 2 soundtrack for the first time ever, starting now. Oh my. Oh! 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 Oh, shit! That's the good shit! God damn! Oh! Oh, God! Oh, yes! Oh! Oh, yes! Oh, God, yes! It really immerses you into the experience, especially at night when you're out and the infected is a lot stronger, and there's volatiles and other zombies that are far stronger than the usual walker, or whatever you want to call it. Just the tension of all that, combined with the soundtrack and the background, it just really brings it to a very tense moment. Especially when you're sneaking through a building and you have to get through all these different zombies without getting detected. Or if you do, you have a huge-ass battle to deal with, if not just fucking die. You'll most likely just end up dying. Oh, by the way, the incense went out. It has been lit once again. So that is another really good aspect. The music is fire, and I have to give credit where credit is due, because Techland absolutely deserves it in that regard. But that positivity aside, we gotta talk about some other issues that, like I was saying before, hold the game back or are part of why the game is held back from being great, and maybe great at best, because it absolutely could be incredible, but it just isn't at that level to me. Something I gotta talk about is the poor launch of the game, because this game, and this is where I get into the but part, in terms of it being good, was not ready to be released. It just wasn't. It was very obviously half-baked because of all the multiple glitches throughout the game. Not even just that, there was a few times where I ended up crashing. Granted, it was only 2 times, but it was noticeable enough to be an annoyance. Also, something I also gotta point out is the poor optimization. Granted, I don't have the most powerful PC in the world, but there's no reason why the game should run as poorly as it does many times. Upon continuing the game, the way that it has these constant frame drops as it's trying to struggle to load everything. There's many times where you'll find enemies just floating throughout the world. In the menus, for example, Aiden won't even be standing there properly. He'll just be in the fucking menus. He's T-posing. The motherfucker's T-posing. There's also many times where I would have to end up reloading the game along with certain story objectives just not loading, period, for a good 10 to 15 minutes on top of reloading that part of the game as well, which that got pretty irritating pretty quickly. Another small issue, which the fact that this is not here is a bit baffling. The lack of a manual save option. Why is there no manual save option? Also, why are the key bindings so limited in options? Because there's been many times where, because the key bindings are so limited, and because certain actions are limited to the same keys, it's led to me, in many instances, doing the thing I'm not intending to do. Because two different abilities in the game, weapon and replenishing health, are both tied to H. Since I was playing a keyboard and mouse, it led to me many times, instead of pulling out a weapon properly, accidentally using up a health kit when I'm not attempting to, which there is a secondary key for the weapons, but it doesn't change the fact that the way it's binded is just very awkward at times. It doesn't work as well as it should, and as time went on in the game and you unlock more and more abilities, this just became more and more apparent to me. And another thing I gotta say is that a part of what also holds the game back is that it's not too different from the first game. It's more of what you enjoyed about the first game, and that's as far as it goes. It's not a huge step forward for the franchise. It's good. It's a good game, it's a good time to be had, but it's nothing that is gonna blow your socks off. But it could have absolutely been more, especially after 7 years of waiting. This game should have been more than what it was. But there's no denying that the game had a very troubled development cycle. It definitely needed more time. It feels a bit half-baked for that reason. So it's good for what it is, but I mean, hey, at least it's not completely lacking of content and completely broken in some way. So, I mean, points for that. But we'll just have to see how things pan out in the future, especially as we get more story content in the form of DLC expansion packs. I'm definitely looking forward to that, and if I were to compare this to the first game again, considering how similar it is to that game, honestly, I would have to say I still prefer the first game over this one. Maybe the following gets included in that, but even not including that, I think I prefer the first one. Yet again, with the first one, I played the whole thing co-op, including the following expansion, whereas this, I played it on its own, so maybe my thoughts originally on Dying Light 1 were a bit skewed, but I doubt that. I remember really loving that game, and this is a good sequel. It's a good game, but again, for the millionth time in this video, they could have done more with it. But for what it is, it works as a good starting point, and I'm definitely curious to see how the game ends up in the future, where it goes from here, and I'm hoping that they'll put out all sorts of updates that really fix things up, and the game, for that reason, only becomes better and better in the long run. And perhaps it will reach that point of being truly great someday, if not amazing. So, there you go. Another game that's been followed on the channel for quite some time now, in a way has reached its conclusion on the channel. Granted, that's not to say that I'm done talking about Dying Light 2. Definitely not. There is more that I want to do. It just feels like, in a way, this is sort of like the end of an era, similar to the Halo Infinite review. But that aside, one last thing I gotta say is this game something worth buying right now? Honestly, get it discounted, and that's gonna be it. What do you guys think of this game? For those who have played it, what are your thoughts on Dying Light 2? Make sure to leave them in the comment section below. And with that being said, that's gonna be it for the review. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. But until then, I'm out. Later.